The lion cubs ran toward her, massive, muscular, wild. But what they did next stunned every soul at the reserve. They didn't growl. They didn't attack. Instead, they curled up beside the German shepherd who once fed them with her own milk and began to purr. This is the story of how one act of desperation became the most powerful testament to motherhood the animal kingdom has ever witnessed. It all began with a mother's rejection. Sirona, a lioness rescued from near death in the wild, gave birth to 2 fragile cubs on a cold September morning. The staff at the White Lion Reserve in South Africa had monitored her pregnancy for months, celebrating each milestone, preparing the den, ensuring everything was perfect. But nature had other plans. When the cubs emerged, wet and mewling, Sirona did something that shattered every heart watching. She refused to feed them. She turned her back, walked away, and settled in the far corner of her enclosure as if they didn't exist. The staff tried everything. They brought her back to the cubs. They placed them near her belly. They waited, hoped, prayed. But Sirona remained distant, her maternal instinct seemingly broken by trauma or illness no one could fully understand. Hours turned into a day. The cubs grew weaker. Their cries became fainter. Their tiny bodies trembled from cold and hunger. The veterinary team knew the grim reality. Without mother's milk, these cubs had perhaps 48 hours to live. Bottle feeding was an option, but newborn lions needed more than just nutrition. They needed warmth, comfort, the steady heartbeat of a mother. They needed connection. That's when Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the reserve's head veterinarian, made a desperate call. She reached out to every contact she had, asking for something almost unheard of, a nursing dog willing to foster lion cubs. A few hours later, a dusty truck pulled up to the reserve gates. Inside were Marcus and Linda Botha, a farming couple from a nearby town, and their 8-year-old German shepherd named Sandra. Sandra wasn't just any dog. She was loyal, disciplined, protective of her family. She had just given birth to a single pup 3 weeks earlier and still had milk to spare. But there was one significant detail that made everyone nervous. Sandra had never liked cats. Not house cats, not strays, not the barn cats that wandered onto the Botha farm. She would chase them, bark at them, make it clear they weren't welcome. The idea of putting her with lion cubs seemed absurd, possibly dangerous. But Marcus insisted. "She's a mother first," he said. "Let's at least try." The staff prepared the enclosure with cameras rolling, emergency protocols in place. They brought her in slowly, her leash held by 2 handlers. The cubs lay in a heated box, barely moving, their eyes still closed, their breath shallow. Sandra entered the space cautiously. Her ears perked, her nose twitched. Everyone held their breath, muscles tensed, ready to pull her back at the first sign of aggression. Would she growl? Would she turn away? Would her natural aversion to felines override everything else? No. She walked over deliberately, her tail low but not tucked. She circled the box once, sniffing deeply. Then she did something that no one expected. She lay down beside it, rolled slightly to expose her belly, and let out a soft whine, the same sound mother dogs make to call their puppies. The staff carefully lifted the cubs and placed them near her. There was a moment of stillness, of collective hope hanging in the air. Then the cubs, guided by pure instinct, began to crawl toward her warmth. They found her teats and began to feed. A hush of awe fell across the reserve. For the first time in days, the cubs were warm, fed, and safe. Dr. Mitchell wept openly. Marcus squeezed his wife's hand. The handlers stood motionless, witnesses to something sacred. Sandra didn't just save their lives that day. She became their mother. The weeks that followed were nothing short of miraculous. The cubs, named Leo and Leela, grew fast. their bodies strengthened with each passing day. Their fur thickened into the golden coat of healthy lion cubs. Their eyes opened to see not a lioness, but a German shepherd watching over them. Sandra was devoted. She licked them clean after every feeding, her rough tongue grooming their faces with maternal precision. She guarded their sleep, positioning her body between them and any perceived threat. She even taught them gentleness, correcting them with soft nudges when their play became too rough. She was outnumbered, outsized, and of a different species, but her love outweighed it all.
Even when their tiny claws began to scratch her skin, leaving thin red lines across her belly, she never flinched. Even when their sharp baby teeth nipped too hard during nursing, drawing occasional drops of blood, she never barked, never snapped. She endured it all, because to her, they were hers. The reserve became a phenomenon. News spread globally. Videos of the unlikely family went viral. Scientists flew in to observe. Journalists camped outside the gates. But inside the enclosure, oblivious to the attention, Sandra simply continued being a mother. Dr. Mitchell documented everything. She noted how Sandra adjusted her behavior as the cubs grew, becoming more tolerant of their increasing roughness. She observed how the cubs responded to Sandra's discipline, learning boundaries that would serve them well as they matured. But there was a clock ticking that everyone tried to ignore. Eventually, they outgrew her. By 4 months, Leo and Lila each weighed over 60 pounds. They were becoming powerful, their movements less puppy-like and more predatory. Their play fights, once gentle tumbles, now involved real strength. Sandra, aging and smaller, couldn't keep up anymore. Her body showed the strain. Her milk had long dried up and her energy waned. The staff made the painful decision. For Sandra's safety and the cubs' continued development, they had to be separated. On a gray morning in February, Sandra was returned to her human family. Leo and Lila were moved to a larger enclosure suitable for juvenile lions. The transition was handled with care, but it was heartbreaking nonetheless. As Marcus led Sandra away, she looked back once, her ears folded back, her tail low. Leo and Lila watched her go, confused, calling out with sounds that were neither roar nor meow, but something in between, the voice of children losing their mother. The Bothas took Sandra home, where she reunited with her biological pup. But for weeks, she would walk to the truck each morning, as if waiting to return to the reserve. At night, she would whine softly, dreaming perhaps of the cubs she'd left behind. Time passed. Seasons changed. 2 years later, the reserve had changed dramatically. Leo and Lila were no longer cubs. They were magnificent specimens of their species. Leo at 450 pounds, Lila at 380, with muscles like coiled springs beneath their thick coats. They were, by every measure, apex predators. That autumn, the reserve planned a documentary about their unusual beginning. The director, Thomas Kruger, reached out to the Bothas with an ambitious idea: bring Sandra back for a reunion. The footage, if it worked, would be unprecedented. Marcus and Linda were nervous. Sandra was now 10 years old, slower, grayer around the muzzle, and the cubs she'd nursed were now enormous predators. "What if they don't remember?" Linda asked. "What if they do, but their instincts have changed?" Marcus added. Dr. Mitchell couldn't guarantee anything. She explained, lion cognition is complex. They have excellent memory for locations, for other lions, even for humans who treated them well. But a dog who nursed them as cubs? There's simply no scientific precedent. But Thomas was insistent. We'll have every safety measure in place. At the first sign of danger, we extract Sandra immediately. The day of the reunion arrived with camera crews, safety personnel, and a palpable tension in the air. Sandra stepped out of the truck, older but still alert. Her tail wagged slightly when she smelled the familiar scents of the reserve. Marcus walked her toward the large enclosure where Leo and Lila lived. The lions were resting in the shade, looking every inch the dangerous predators they were. Staff members were positioned at every angle. A tranquilizer rifle was ready. The gate to a safety corridor stood open. Sandra and Marcus entered through the first barrier, then the second. Then they stood at the final gate,
the only thing separating a 10-year-old German shepherd from two full-grown lions. "Last chance to reconsider," Thomas said quietly. Marcus looked down at Sandra. She wasn't cowering. She was eager, pulling slightly on the leash, her nose pressed to the gate. "Open it," Marcus said. The gate swung wide.
A moment of terrible silence. The lions spotted her immediately. Their heads lifted, their bodies tensed. They stood, suddenly alert, focused entirely on the small dog who had just entered their territory. Then they moved, fast. A handler reached for the gate. "Get her out!" someone shouted. But Thomas raised his hand, his voice barely a whisper. "Wait!" Leo reached Sandra first. His massive head, larger than her entire torso, lowered toward her. He sniffed, once, twice. Then his entire demeanor changed. His tail began to move, not the aggressive thrash of an agitated lion, but a gentle sway. Leela arrived a second later. She pressed her face against Sandra's side, and then something extraordinary happened. Both lions began to make a sound, not a roar, not a growl, but a deep, rumbling purr that vibrated through the air. They circled Sandra gently, rubbing against her like house cats greeting their owner. They brushed their massive bodies against her, so carefully, as if remembering how fragile she was. Then, as if choreographed, they lay down on either side of her. Sandra, without hesitation, began to lick their enormous faces, the same grooming behavior she'd performed when they were cubs. Leo closed his eyes. Leela rested her head on her paws. The entire reserve stood in stunned silence. Then, one by one, people began to cry. The staff who'd been there from the beginning, the camera operators behind their lenses, Marcus and Linda holding each other, Dr. Mitchell, who'd seen thousands of animal interactions in her career, wiped tears from her cheeks. "This," she whispered to no one in particular, "should not be possible." But it was happening. For 20 minutes Sandra lay between the two lions, dwarfed by their size, but clearly recognized, clearly loved. They nuzzled her. She groomed them. The three of them created a portrait of connection that defied every rule of nature documentaries. That night, as Sandra lay next to Leo and Leela under the brilliant African moon, Thomas spoke to the camera with a trembling voice. "What we witness today is not instinct, it is not conditioning. It is not explainable by science as we currently understand it. What we witness today is love." Scientists who later reviewed the footage admitted such bonds are nearly unheard of. A dog raising lions, that's rare but documented. But those lions remembering her, greeting her like a mother after 2 years of separation, after becoming fully wild in every other respect, that was unprecedented. That was miraculous. Before Sandra left that evening, she spent a few more minutes with Leo and Leela. As the botas led her toward the gate, both lions stood and watched. They didn't follow, but they didn't look away either. And Sandra, as she had 2 years before, looked back. This wasn't just a tale about survival. It was about motherhood across species, about love unbreakable by time, size, or form. It was about how the fiercest creatures on earth never forgot the gentle dog who fed them when no one else would. Because sometimes the strongest family is the one love creates, not biology. And sometimes the most powerful force in nature isn't a tooth or claw. It's a memory wrapped in gratitude, preserved across years, waiting for one more moment to say, "I remember you, Mother. I remember."